Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Station Network, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is John Noakes. He's an internationally known scholar on the policing of political protest. He's chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminal Justice at Arcadia University. In addition to the policing of protests, Professor Noakes has also published research on the origins of the FBI and FBI surveillance of Hollywood in the 1940s. At Arcadia, he teaches courses on social theory, social movements, comparative criminal justice systems, and wrongful convictions, among others. I met John Noakes at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference, which was held at Arcadia. I have a feeling you had something to do with that.
I didn't. It was just a happy surprise.
Cool. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And tell me a bit more about what your work is. What do you do?
So our primary work, myself and a couple colleagues, Pat Gillum who's out at Washington State, and Bob Edwards at East Carolina State, is to try to understand how police respond to street protests and put that in the context of the history of police response to street protests. We're really looking at broad patterns. And what we do that a lot of people don't do is that we do our work primarily by going to the protests and doing observations. So we're on the streets observing, taking notes, and then we try to follow up afterwards when we can with interviews with police officials. We really want to understand what the police are doing, which helps, I think, in general, understand the context in which social movements take place.
Keep going. So
what we're really interested in, and what we started doing this was after Seattle in 1999, and particularly after a set of protests that happened in 2000. So the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, a couple of global justice protests in Washington, D.C. And what we started to notice was that the police were responding in a fundamentally different way than they had prior to that. So we went through a long period through the mid-70s to the 80s, through most of the 90s, where there wasn't a lot of violent confrontation in the streets. There was a lot of what looked like accommodation. And in fact, protesters and police had worked out a set of agreements. The literature calls this the negotiated management model, where they had begun to talk ahead of time and really kind of choreograph what any protest would look like. So this would include everything from the standard stuff about where you could march and when you could march and how you could conduct your protest, to, in some situations, when arrests would be made and under what circumstances and who would get arrested. All of this kind of choreographed ahead of time, creating a situation where protests could happen easily and they could get their message across. But it created a kind of sterile environment for protests. Just a couple of quick quotes to show you this is, talked to a police officer in Washington, D.C. he started talking about the Million Man March, the second Million Man March. And he said, the first one. He said, the Million Man March was really parade duty, because they had negotiated everything ahead of time so that the protesters knew what was going to happen, or the protest groups, and the police knew. And this allowed for a kind of clean, like I said before, kind of sterile protest, but not one that threatened to really disrupt anything at any point in time. And then we have a paper that's based on a quote from a protester we talked to, who said his goal in this particular march in DC was to do more than march in a circle. That they wanted to, in this case, kind of do something that would begin to shut down the system or challenge the system more fundamentally than just being in the streets and arguing. So we think that a lot of people grew tired of the protest system that was in place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you see that starting to happen in Seattle, where protesters just stop cooperating with police and engage in a different kind of protest that succeeds in shutting down the World Trade Association meetings for a day, which in retrospect may not be the greatest event that ever happened, but it was so different from what happened in years prior. And what
it's really a very historic protest that I think stands out among protests for the intensity, really.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure you have a better word than intensity that kind of looks at the parameters of protest.
Well, so if you think about what happened in Seattle, what you have is protesters who said basically they just weren't going to cooperate, meaning that they weren't going to tell the police ahead of time where they were going to go, and they weren't going to kind of trade away the right to protest in exchange for the police guarantee that they could be in one place at one time and that they would stop counter-protesters from intervening. So they did the protest with many of them without permits, so that they freed themselves. The permit process is really the beginning of the negotiation of what the protest will look like. And
let me just break in a second. Yeah. Now, there are some constitutional amendments. There are elements of the Constitution that have to do with freedom of assembly.
Yeah.
Does that specify that you have to get permits?
So what the court says, what the Supreme Court says, is that localities have the right to manage essentially the manner of protest. There's a series of things that the court guarantees. So they don't say that you can stop protests, and you can't stop protests because of content, but they do say that police and municipalities have the right essentially to shape it. So the time, space, and manner of the protest, the municipalities have under the court rulings, have a constitutional right to shape. So the question is, how does that shaping process occur? And do protesters have to go along with it?
And in recent years, I know during Occupy, they would use, I forget what the word was, but they would use like mesh gating to hold people into very specific places. And at different conventions, they kind of segregated protesters and limited them to very distant, specific places away from where they needed to be to get their message out.
Absolutely, and so we have argued that this attempt to control space, essentially, to move people around in space, is part of what this new approach to protest policing tries to accomplish. So if we go back to the 1960s, you have the use of force to achieve your end. And you have, it's very effective from the police perspective in many ways, but it also creates martyrs. So, if you read the history of the civil rights movement, King certainly was aware of this. King used this against municipalities, so he would pick police that he knew would respond with violence. And then that violence became a way to recruit people and to encourage sympathy and to bear witness to what was going on in the South. During this period of negotiated management, martyrs weren't being created, but they were essentially shutting down protests by consent. They got everyone to agree to play nice.
Now you use a term, you've got a paper that you published, strategic incapacitation. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, in the current period, yes. So the current period incapacitation can mean any number of things, but it essentially means if you can stop people from protest or make it ineffective or put it in a place where it doesn't matter, then you can achieve your ends without arresting people. You can achieve your ends without violence, certainly by the use of force, but you're not leaving martyrs on the street. So for example, if you go to a protest now, there's lots of fencing. There's lots of sort of barriers that tell you can go here or you can't go here. Recently, we've begun seeing sort of TSA style packed places that you have to pass through, like an airport, to get into the main area of a protest. So they're not wanting to use weapons if they don't have to. They're not wanting to use the sort of violent force if they don't have to, which is not to say they won't, but they try to keep it to the side. But they're using these other methods to make protests more difficult to engage in and to control protests when they do occur.
So I've covered many protests, and in Philadelphia, there's a team, a police unit. I think it's community policing or something.
Affairs.
Civil affairs?
Yeah, the civil affairs unit.
Civil affairs. And you see the same people at each, the same police wearing the same armbands, identifying them, the same people holding the video cameras at all these different protests. And I've seen how they lead the protest. If it's a march, the police will literally walk at the front of the protest, which doesn't really impress in terms of challenging the system.
Yeah, and so civil affairs units are kind of a leftover from negotiated management. Police departments still prefer to negotiate the protest parameters if they can. Strategic incapacitation comes into play when the protesters aren't interested in negotiating, when they don't negotiate away the opportunity to surprise people or to shut down streets or things like that. So those civil affairs units are the ones who have usually negotiated agreements and are trying to sort of somewhat calmly have a protest run its course. And that's an approach that police prefer if it works. It tends not to work if the goal of the protesters is to momentarily shut the system down, or, put a cog in, put their bodies in the cog of the machine.
So I've been privy to some of the not direct, but indirectly to knowing about the discussions and the decision making of organizations planning protests. And, some of them will just refuse to agree to participate with the police. And then there are others. We covered extensively a protest in Philadelphia of a recruiting center that was in what was then Franklin Mills Mall, and it was the biggest recruiting center ever created. It had video games that included actual tanks or not tanks, but Humvees and helicopters, so that kids could go and play a game in actual tanks and Humvees and helicopters. And it was like war porn for kids they were trying to recruit. And so they went along with the police, registered with them. The police walked at the beginning, but when they got there, at a certain point, certain people had decided they were going to engage in civil disobedience. And when it was time for them to clear out, they refused to, and they sat down there and they got themselves arrested. And at that time, one of our reporters was there taking pictures, and she got arrested as well, just because she was taking pictures. It ended up that she was represented by Paul Hexnetter, who was on the panel that you were on, where I met you at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference. And he ended up suing the city and getting a settlement for her. And not that long after that, the city set a new policy that made it so that that kind of thing wouldn't happen anymore. But I think that's one of the ways that organizations do things. They go along with the police, and then they have a plan ahead of time for those people who want to engage in civil disobedience and get arrested.
So there's a strategic back and forth between police departments and social movements. So when a movement organization or a group of activists figure out a way to gain an inch, the police go back and they figure out how to way to take that inch back. And then the protesters respond and the police officers respond. So after Seattle, if we go back to that example, the police were caught completely off guard that first day. The protesters take over the streets of Seattle. They shut down the WTO for a day. As that day goes on, the police engage in a series of battles on the street. We hadn't seen battles like that for some time in US streets, with mostly less lethal weaponry. They clear the streets, and then they build a big fence around an area. And this is one of the things we talk about, this control of space. So they, instead of having to fight that battle each time, they build this huge fence, and then they just guard the fence, and they say, okay, you can't go in past this fence. And that means that at that point that there'd been a fence, but it had just covered the sort of convention area. Now they extended it to take up the space where the people in the motels were. So now everyone could move easily. That part of the city was kind of closed down to everyone else, but people could move back and forth easily. So that's the first response by the police. What you then see is that at the next several sets of events, these things are put in place at the beginning. So fences are bigger, spaces that are cordoned off are larger, or impromptu ways of controlling space are put into play. And then what you see is when you get a chance to reschedule meetings, the next set of national meetings, international meetings, are put in places that protesters can't get to. They're put in the woods in Calgary, Alberta. They're put on islands off the coast of Europe. They're put in countries that have no respect for the right to protest at all. So protesters were essentially shut out from those spaces. Now, eventually, organizations got tired of meeting at places like that, and they had to move back into usually large urban capitals. And by that point, the police had really developed a set of practices that would allow them to frustrate protesters and keep them as far away as possible from the event they were trying to influence.
What practices?
Well, the major one is this sort of cordoning off of space. So a lot of them would happen in areas where maybe one side of the border in the city would be a river, and then they would extend fences out, and they would take up a significant part of space in what they would call a hard zone or a red zone, where the only people allowed in that space were people who were part of the event. So the leaders, the people attending the convention or the conference, and then there'd be a second zone, which we might refer to as a yellow zone or a soft zone, where only people who were engaged in normal commerce in that area would be allowed to go, but protest activity wouldn't be allowed. And then there'd be this final fence, and outside of that, they'd say, okay, you can engage in protest out there. And then there might be, as you suggested earlier, an area where they say protesters can be here. Protesters never go there. If you see anyone in a protest pen, you know they're not experienced protesters, and they're not going to have much say in what's going on, because no one likes the protest pit. But they do.
I want to add one thing, because it really bothered me. I was covering a Netroots conference, and one of the speakers was Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. This was, I think, the same year as Occupy, 2011. Right. And they created an area like that for journalists. Mm-hmm. Like Trump does it now, but Clinton did it too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's all, there's all these attempts to sort of put people in a space that you can then watch what they do
and control them.
You know, there are a lot of indie journalists like yourself and others who create problems for the police because they take lots of videos and they're able to show those videos later. It's much easier to get a video from the event onto the air or sent around to people on social media very quickly now. So it undermines the narratives that police want to put out about what actually has happened.
Yes, there's no question about it. It makes me think of when I was covering a protest during Occupy in Washington, D.C. A bunch of protesters went up to the National Air and Space Museum because of militarization of that technology. And it ended up that the security people there used pepper spray. And I was the only one to capture any footage of it and capture a little in my eyes as well.
Yeah. So I think, so you've introduced pepper spray. I think we should talk about this sort of category of less lethal weaponry. It's called various things. It's sometimes called non-lethal. I think we have enough evidence to know that it's not always non-lethal.
All right, let's just do a brief station show ID, okay? Just it's the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, and we're going to just pause for a few seconds so that when I'm editing this for the radio show, I can find it easily and pop in the bumper.
Okay.
Okay, and my guest for the show is John Noakes. He's a professor at Arcadia University. He's the chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminal Justice, and He studies the policing of protests and the history of the FBI, and he teaches courses on social theory, social movements, comparative criminal justice systems, and wrongful convictions, among other things. And you're going to tell us about non-lethal approaches that the police use now.
So this introduction of, as I was saying before, this sort of variously called less lethal or non-lethal or less than lethal weaponry is similar in our mind to these questions about moving people around space. And the reason we say that is because, so while it's not a pleasant thing, and I will say that it's not happened to me, my understanding of being pepper sprayed is that it's particularly awful. You lose the mucus from your body and you're incapacitated for a period of time. But in an hour or so, you get up and you walk away. Well, an hour is all the police really need to clear a protest from the streets. They don't need to create martyrs. They don't want to create martyrs, but they achieve their end because they can incapacitate people for a period of time. If you think through the different kinds of weapons that have been introduced recently, things like rubber bullets, which if used the way they're intended to be used, cause significant welts and pain. But again, if they're used correctly, should not kill anyone, should not leave any martyrs. Flashbangs, pepper spray, all of this creates a lot of discomfort and makes it difficult for people to be in a particular space for a period of time. And that's all the police need to achieve their ends. They don't really need to shoot someone in the head to be able to clear a street. They'd much rather clear a street with this less lethal weaponry because then they don't have to deal with the aftermath.
And we all remember back years ago, around the time of Occupy in California, there was a university protest where a security police person there took a can of pepper spray and sprayed it directly into the faces of a group of people who were sitting at a protest. And around that time, I had an expert on pepper spray on the show, and he made it clear that that is totally against the legal usage of pepper spray. It's not supposed to be used that way.
Absolutely not. And I would, so if we think about police and the use of force continuum, the use of force continuum suggests that you should respond, police officers should only respond with the force necessary to meet the force being provided in the other direction. So in that situation, I said before, pepper spray is unlikely to kill someone, even when used as inappropriately as that. But it's also it is a use of force, and it's a much stronger use of force than is recommended by the force continuum. It's also more likely to be used more frequently. So if you've got, if you have the ability to use force that's not going to have long-term implications, then you're much more likely to use it than you will to shoot someone, for example, or to hit them with a stick. So we think that these less lethal weapons have led to more force being used, even though they're supposed to pare down the amount of force in any given incident, because we think police officers use them more often. Well,
let me look at this from the other side. You described that police use of force is based on a continuum, based on proportionate force from the other side. What are the levels of, quote, force that protesters use, that police would have on a continuum?
So if you're dealing with a nonviolent protest, then in one way of looking at this is protesters aren't using force at all. They are refusing officer orders. They are refusing instructions from the police to move. They are blocking the public thoroughfare. But they're not using amount of force that threatens the life of an officer, or even threatens physical injury to an officer. So I think at this point you would have to argue if police were going to use any force, they would use nothing beyond the use of hands to capture someone. But like I just said, I think that the attraction, if that word's correct for police, about less lethal weapons is they can achieve their end more quickly, and they know that the person will recover. They know that there's not going to be long-term damage. So in a sense, they're kind of fudging the use of force continuum. I'm surprised there haven't been more lawsuits about this, but I've not seen any litigation around it.
That would be. Now, recently, the Pos POTUS uh,
Mm-hmm.
basically said that if people threw rocks from his fear campaign, if they came up through Mexico through the border, the caravan, that he would order that they be shot. And from what I understand, this is what's happened in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Which led me to write an article recently speculating that Israel might have given him the idea for that. Have you looked at all at Israel's response to Palestinians and Gazans? And
I mean, no more than the average person watching the news. I wouldn't claim expertise in it.
Okay. And we know that in Pennsylvania in the past, Israel has played a role in identifying potential activists, because at least one of the writers at Op-Ed News was on the list. So does Israel play any role in any of the police strategies that you know of?
So I'm not aware of that. I don't know either way. One of the things that I think differentiates what we do is that we do what we do primarily on the street. So we're observing police actions as they happen. The background and the digging we necessarily sort of sacrifice because there's only so much we can accomplish. This question of surveillance is something that we think is important, but that we don't spend a lot of time investigating or researching. It's very difficult to investigate and research things like that. And so we've used our limited amount of time to kind of focus on police actions on the street.
All right, so what else have you learned about by going out to the protests? Now, you did a lot of work with Occupy too, which is more recent. That's than 2000. What did you come up with there?
So again, New York City is really pretty far advanced in this strategic incapacitation model. They wouldn't use those words, but I think that they have become particularly accomplished at or as trying to sort of displace protesters and redistribute people in space. We talk about a particular protest that happened in Occupy, I believe was the second month anniversary, and there was a large march of people who were going to be going over the Brooklyn Bridge. And the police had made the process accessible in a sense, in that you could get to the park where the rally was going to be and you could get over the bridge. But they had made it so constraining and so bottlenecked that it was physically difficult to do it. You stood around a lot, you moved very slowly. Some protesters continued to do it, but they had effectively created a situation where if you were going to do this, your commitment of your physical commitment was extreme. You had to be willing to stick with this in very adverse conditions. So if you go to court, do they say, well, you didn't let them protest, that's a problem? Probably not. They let people come in, they let people march. But as an activist, do you feel like you had the right to do this? Again, probably not. They had really constrained it to such a degree that it was very difficult. One thing that happened at that protest was that activists projected an image of the bat from Batman onto the side of a building, which raised everyone's spirits and serves as a kind of symbolic breaking of the physical limitations that were put on them. I don't think this is going to change the nature of humankind, but we do see it as one example of ways in which protesters respond to what police do, just as police respond to what protesters do.
Yeah, and we've seen that in a number of cases, like in Washington. There have been a number of times when projectors have been used to project images on the Trump hotel down there, where he's making a fortune, violating the emoluments clause.
Yeah, and it's a symbolic move, but it's one of the things you can do if they really prevent you from accessing space. So it's pretty easy to prevent people from accessing the Trump Hotel if you want to. It's got a road, a side road to its main entrance. You can easily shut that off. So if they want to prevent people from going there, they can. And at least this is a symbolic breaking of those barriers.
Now, I have had it from good sources that the Obama administration played a role in what happened with Occupy. Can you talk about that at all?
again, that's something that we've left to others to do research on. I know that we know that city mayors across the country had sort of got together and talked through how they should respond. But I don't know particularly about the connections. I would not be shocked. In fact, I'd be shocked if there was an FBI coordination in here, sharing of surveillance information. We know police departments talk to one another. We know they share information. It would make perfect sense if they would use national agencies as brokers. We know that there are these fusion centers around the country where intelligence is shared by a whole series of agencies, and local police are able to get information from federal agencies at that point. So I will speculate that that's probably true. I don't know.
Now, one role that FBI and CIA agents are trained to perform is to infiltrate, to pretend being somebody else, to get people to do things, to get people to give up information. And I'm pretty sure that that happened within Occupy. Do you have any information on that?
I don't. I know that Philadelphia has a prohibition against undercover agents that was based on a case a few years back where they were sued and they agreed not to do it. I know that in 2000, during the Republican convention, they got around that by having state police serve as undercover agents. So the puppet factories during the Republican convention in 2000 had state police officers acting as carpenters, putting together puppets. And then at some point, the people in the puppet factory decided they wanted to go join a protest that was going to block a exit or entrance to a highway. And the state police officers offered to drive, and they got in the van and took them right to the police department. So we know some things, some documented activities, but if surveillance is done well, you don't hear about it.
Yeah, that's true. Now, you know about that because there was this pretty strong defense of those protesters back in 2000.
Right.
Okay. So you described this back and forth, this balance between the police and the protesters using different strategies. Are there any other strategies that the protesters use in response to the police strategies of strategic incapacitation?
Yeah, so if you, we're working on some stuff now looking at some of the activities of Occupy protesters in New York. And these aren't major things that you would necessarily notice if you were covering the protest for a day, or if you were just looking at it from afar or looking at the highlights on TV. But there are ways in which we see Occupy protesters responding to this attempt to control space. So I'll just give you one example. There were the people who were doing research with us, led by Pat Gillum, were watching protesters do snake marches, for example, where a series of protesters get together and they kind of march in a zigzag pattern through a space. And from one perspective, it just looks like it might be a little bit of fun, and it looks like it might be a way to just sort of cause some disruption and make a point. It also distracts police and takes attention away from their observations of other groups, and it provides at least a temporary barrier between, say, where the police are set up and a group of protesters might be or activists might be. So we were watching times when you'd see a snake march go through, and then you might see a group of protesters kind of quietly slide off to go off to another space. That snake march serves to just sort of intervene in the surveillance for a brief moment, and to put a blockade, in a sense, for a brief moment between the police and those activists. They get away off to where they want to go. So that's an example of one kind of small thing that protesters might do because they know that they're being surveilled and that space is being managed, and they have to.
That's almost military strategy with flanking and what have you.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, I think that a lot of it's intuitive. I'm not sure that people sit around and draw this all out ahead of time, but it's just kind of on the spot as things are happening. How do people create things to create diversions and come up with ways to get what they want to do?
Well, I've been to some planning and preparation sessions, and I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't on the spot. There's a lot of thinking that goes into many protests where people who are planning to get arrested for the first time are coached on exactly what to do, what to carry with them, who to contact when it happens. Protesters can be very smart and very strategic in what they do.
No, I don't disagree. And we know that successful things get diffused to other protests, either because people hear about them or know people who were in one protest. So there's this way in which tactics move sort of slowly from one protest to another and spread around. Not as coordinated perhaps, but much like the same thing happens with police, where they come up with tactics they think work and they spread them around. So when protesters decide to put PVC pipe across their arms and the chains inside so that police can't simply carry them off an intersection, police immediately start scrambling for ways to cut through PVC pipe. And when they come up with a solution, they pass it on to other police departments.
Now, in recent years, there was the distribution of surplus military equipment to police departments. Has that changed things?
So in some places, yes. And there's I wouldn't say there's a split, but there are people who really think that militarization is the way to explain everything that's happened. I think that's true in certain places. Certainly if we look at Ferguson, the attempt to intimidate through militarization was clear. But there are lots of protests where you never see anything like that. We were just at in 2016, we were at the conventions in Cleveland and Philadelphia. We spent the full conventions on the streets, observing, watching the police, taking notes from the police. And I don't think we have anything in our notes about military style weaponry. I would actually.
I was there at Philadelphia in the streets during it, and I didn't see any. I think the police were very restrained. Although, I mean, you couldn't take a subway to the stop where the convention was held. You had to walk 3/4 of a mile to get there.
So those of you who know Philadelphia know that the convention was at the one end of Broad Street, and City Hall's up a bit further, and lots of protests took place at City Hall, and lots of protests took place outside the convention. So we're observing a march from City Hall to the convention, and we hear over a police radio as the police officers are riding around on bikes. We hear over police radio the instruction to basically stand back, give them lots of space, and just make sure they don't get out of control.
Now, is that one of your research tools, tracking police radio?
So we actually were just sitting there watching, and somebody rode by on a bike, and they slowed down in front of us, and we heard this call. I later had the opportunity to interview the person who sort of commanded the response to the protest for the Philadelphia police, and I read him back that quote, and he said, "Yeah, that's basically what we did." I mean, they had decided that, and we can talk maybe about why they did that. They had decided to just back off, and and they gave up lots of the street. They gave up sort of the whole neighborhood from City Hall to Broad Street, which is pretty long. And they just kind of let people come and go as they pleased. And they just sort of grinned and bared it for 4 or 5 days. There was one moment that we observed right at the end of the protest. It was right on the night when everyone gave their speeches in the convention. And we had gotten word from inside that the convention speeches were over and people were starting to disperse. And we were sort of getting ready to shut down for the day. And there was a school bus, not far from where everyone was gathered by the subway station you were mentioning earlier. And off the bus comes 40, 50 police officers in full riot gear. No provocation, there's nothing going on. They march down into the middle of all the protesters. They stop, they look around, they turn around, they walk back and get on the bus. So I bring this up when I interview the guy from Philadelphia, and he says, yeah, there might have been some miscommunication there. So what you have is you have this group, we know this is always true, but you get to see it in this case. You know that right behind the lines of police who are standing back are the groups of police in riot gear who are ready should they be needed?
Well, getting back to Occupy,
Yeah.
I went a lot of times. I went to 7 different Occupy locales and spent a decent amount of time down in the Philadelphia one, which was right next to City Hall. And the police were pretty laid back.
Mm-hmm.
They would escort anytime there was a protest. They would walk around with them, and usually there were police on bicycles or motorcycles. But the way the city ended up handling it was they said they basically evicted them, and they basically changed City Hall so it can never happen again. They've now got a kind of a water sculpture. Yeah. I don't know what you want to call it, but it's like water fountains every 5 feet.
So I would suggest to you that, certainly the water fountains are not unintentional. They have the same thing in the public square in Cleveland. So the place in Cleveland where all the protests were going on during the Republican convention in 2016, 6 o'clock every night or so, they would turn the water fountains on. Very sort of passive, apparently unintentional, but we don't think it's unintentional, way to sort of say this space is no longer available. Mm-hmm. The thing I would add to this, and which I think is sort of a counter to arguments about militarization, again, I fully agree that militarization's happened in some places, is that we see bicycle police becoming a huge part of what police are doing. We see bicycle police as very mobile barriers. So instead of putting up these sort of heavy metal barriers that have to be moved around by police officers, they just kind of figured out if they buy a bunch of bikes, they can make barriers with bikes, and they can put a bike at point A and then have those bikes 2 miles away in 20 minutes set up to do exactly the same thing.
Or as protesters are walking down the street, they can keep half the street open by having a row of bikes along with the protesters.
Absolutely, and they're very good at sort of setting the bikes up so they effectively function as barriers.
Okay, so we need to take another show ID, and then I would like to talk to you about 2 things. Mm-hmm. Philadelphia's new district attorney, who is very different than most, and your research on the FBI, and It's a Wonderful Life, and how they thought that was a dangerous movie.
So I have about 2:13 on my clock, so we're shooting to end by 2:30?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the Rob Call Show, and we're going to pause for a minute so I can find the time to edit in the bumper. And my guest for the show is John Noakes. He's an internationally known scholar on the policing of political protests, and he's a chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminal Justice at Arcadia University. So what's the deal with Larry Krasner? He's the new DA of Philly. He came in saying he was going to radically change things, unlike most DAs who look to put as many people in jail as possible. He's letting people out. He's changing things. Is that affecting protests at all? And how is that affecting things?
So it's early, and we haven't had any major protests in Philadelphia since he took over. I'm curious to see if it has any effect. He's not in charge of the police department, so I don't expect it
Definitely not. From what I understand, he's at great odds with them.
Yes. And so one example, and we'll see if this plays out in protest, but as you heard at the panel that we met at, one of the things that he said was, I'm not going to be prosecuting minor marijuana offenses anymore. And the police kept arresting people on minor marijuana offenses. So he may have rules that he's set out or guidelines that he's set out, but I don't know if police will respond to them. As you were observing in the about the convention in 2016, the Philadelphia police really see themselves as fairly progressive on protests. Whether they are, I think time will tell, and I think that you would get an argument from the Black Lives Matter people in Philadelphia, but they see themselves as very progressive. They see themselves as having seen the light. Some of it was because of lawsuits after Occupy, and some of it was, I think, an adoption of a policy or philosophy that we're just going to step back and let them exhaust themselves. I watched protesters in Philadelphia march up the wrong way on streets that were full of cars. And you never used to see things like that. That was the one thing they would try to stop, was the intermingling of people who were uninvolved with people who were protesting. They've really backed off a lot. Again, I think a lot of people will have different stories to tell, because I think you don't necessarily see all the stuff that happens quietly and in more secluded places. But I think the Philadelphia police, I think they've decided they're going to step back. I assume that's a strategic move on their part. I don't assume it's a philosophical awakening, but we'll see. I don't know. We'll see what effect Krasner has.
Okay. And so what's the deal with the FBI and It's a Wonderful Life? You've had, it looks like you've had some fun exploring that.
So little known part of the 1940s Hollywood Red Scare is that before HUAC began investigating movies, the FBI was investigating movies. And the FBI was investigating movies because, for the reason they investigated everything, they thought that communists were infiltrating the movies. And they had a very simple mechanism. That mechanism was association. If you knew someone who was a communist or they thought was a communist, you got your name in a file. So they started doing this on movies. And I think one of the things that they realized was that, unlike most investigations they did, anyone who wanted to could spend a nickel and watch the movie. So if the FBI decides that a movie like It's a Wonderful Life is subversive, and you go down to the movie theater and watch it and you don't think it's subversive, then you begin to doubt the FBI's credibility. If the FBI says so-and-so's a communist, we saw him at a meeting and he gave a speech, nobody has any way to verify that. But for movies, anyone who's got a nickel can tell. So anyways, that's a long introduction to say that the FBI got out of the business and turned over all their files to HUAC. But while they were in the business, to HUAC, to the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Okay.
So before they did that, they accumulated a lot of files on a bunch of movies from the 1940s. So I was able to get a hold of those files, and I looked through them, and what I was really interested in is, how does the FBI define something as subversive? What is it that is their criteria?
Now, this was in the 1940s during the time of HUAC.
Yes, so, but it's before HUAC really hit stride with Hollywood. Turns out HUAC's a really bad investigative group. They couldn't find anything. Hoover hated HUAC because he thought HUAC was essentially saying the FBI wasn't doing their job. So for a long time, those two bastions of the right were kind of at odds. But once Hoover figured out that he couldn't do anything with this information, he really couldn't prosecute it because they would get laughed out of court, he just turned it over because, you know, a congressman can go on the floor and declare someone a communist. They don't actually have to have evidence. You kind of have to have evidence if you go to court. So anyways, so one of the movies that they were surveilling was It's a Wonderful Life. And there are some individuals who they were concerned about their associations. But by that time, they'd started worrying about plot. And they worried about plot largely based on a document that was written, we think, by Ayn Rand, who was in Hollywood, exactly. So was in Hollywood at one point as a producer.
Let me just make it really clear. Ayn Rand wrote Fountainhead, and what else did she write?
Atlas Shrugged is the other thing.
And she is like the writer of the Bible for libertarians.
Yeah, she's Paul Ryan's muse.
Yes, in the Fountain, I think it's the Fountainhead. I read that when I was in college, you know, and I thought it was cool then. Now it's like psychotic. This architect designs a building, and the people who actually implement his plans change it. Because it was his idea, he blows up the building. Sorry if I ruined the plot, but
it's a long book. You've saved some people a lot of time. It's rampant individualism at its highest level.
I would say that individualism of that kind is malignant narcissism, like we see in Arcos POTUS in the White House.
So
by the way, you know, I just want to make it clear. I don't say POTUS. I say pos POTUS. And the first P is peace and O is of. So I'll leave out the other part because this goes on the radio.
Fair enough. So one of the movies was It's a Wonderful Life. And in the document that Ayn Rand helped write, she talks about how you can tell a communist movie, a subversive movie, because it makes fun of American institutions, or or it celebrates communist institutions too much. Lots of ways for various movies that became a little ironic, but for It's a Wonderful Life, what it essentially means is that speech that Jimmy Stewart gives, defending the savings and loan, but arguing against Potter's Bank, is seen as un-American because it's discrediting the banking industry. The irony, of course, is that it's actually celebrating one kind of banking industry and opposing another. I think it's better to see it as a critique of monopoly capitalism than it is to see it as a critique of banks.
Of course, they're one and the same now for our current political system, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the other movies that you found that the FBI thought were problematic?
So The Best Years of Our Lives, which wins the Oscar, the year that I believe wins the Oscar for Best Picture, the year that It's a Wonderful Life is released, has a similar critique. Again, there's some individuals that are being critiqued or being connected with communism. But the opening scene of The Best Years of Our Life is a sort of classic fat cat businessman who gets a plane ride over a military guy trying to return from Europe. So you have this critique of capitalism, the argument is, because you put this guy in place who's dressed up like a businessman and got a cigar and he's sort of overweight and he's all the sort of stereotypes. And
Fat cat.
What's that?
Fat cat.
Absolutely. And he manipulates the process to get a seat on a plane that a serviceman can't have. So one of the keys of drama is tension, right? You have to produce conflict. So they produce a conflict there at the beginning to show servicemen returning and the difficulty that's going to be. This is flagged as a criticism of American capitalism. And then in the movie, there are discussions of racism. And if you discussed racism too excitedly or too virulently for them, or if you didn't show how America really was a great country and there were some problems that had to work out, but it would work them out, that would be a flag for denigrating American institutions. If you celebrated the common man, so in It's a Wonderful Life, there's a celebration of the common man. If you celebrate the common man, that's an indication that you're trying to get communist propaganda in. So it was fascinating to watch how they had decided which movies were subversive based on this criteria, and then the application of the criteria to movies.
It's scary.
Mm-hmm.
It really is scary.
Yeah.
And you've also talked or written about the idea that race was depicted in a certain way in Cold War movies.
So if you were too critical of American racial policy, whether that was around African Americans or whether that was around Jews, and Hoover thought Judaism was a race, he thought Jews were a race of people. If you were too critical, so a movie like Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck, which also won an Academy Award for Best Picture, I believe, was seen as too strident on the question. They didn't show the good of America; they only saw it as an anti-Semitic place, and they would analyze who the anti-Semites were and how they were people who were meant to critique the United States as an institution. So they really had to sort of build this narrative about why a movie was subversive. It's fascinating that most of these movies have gone on. Some of them have just gone on to obscurity, but most of them have gone on to some notoriety, and nobody's sitting around thinking It's a Wonderful Life is a bit of communist infiltration.
Where does Jim Crow fit into that?
So Jim Crow fits in because the FBI was a product of its time, and Hoover was, both a product and a producer of his time. And they certainly saw African Americans as threatening. They saw what you would see similar kind of arguments when they started looking at King and other groups. So maybe they had a point, but they went too far. And you remember early on that they really tried hard to connect King to the Communist Party. That absent a Communist Party manipulating him, African Americans would have been perfectly happy to live the way that they did.
And you've written and talked about wrongful convictions and exonerations.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
So I think what's fascinating about wrongful convictions, and we really use it as a sort of prism to teach criminal justice through, is that you can talk about the criminal justice system very effectively by looking at how wrongful convictions occur. So if you look at the first 300 and some DNA exonerations and look at what led to the wrongful conviction, you will, for example, see that 3/4 of them involve some kind of eyewitness misidentification. So now we begin to we can develop a critique of how we do lineups and how we deal with identifications. If 1/4 of the people from that group confess to the crime that we now scientifically can show they didn't do. So now we begin to ask questions about the way in which interrogations are done. How can an interrogation produce a wrongful confession? Not why would someone confess to something they didn't do, but why would the system allow or encourage someone to confess to something they didn't do? Some portion of those cases involve sort of jailhouse snitches. So it opens up this discussion about the ways in which people provide information from inside jails to lower their own sentences. And it also allows you to see the problems with forensics. So, we're in this midst of this celebration of the ability of forensics to solve crime. And from scientists' perspective, the only forensic methodology that has strong scientific testing and backing is DNA analysis. All the rest of it is problematic. So we believe that all fingerprints are unique, but we can't prove that all fingerprints are unique, which in and of itself is not the question. The question is, how are they different? And so how many places of similarity do we need to be able to say that 2 fingerprints are the same? Fingerprints are hardly the biggest problem, but when you get into things like arson investigations, bite mark analysis, fiber comparisons, there's a whole slew of people who are in jail on the basis of very flimsy forensic work. We've corrected the arson problem. We now do scientific studies of fire, but we're still finding people in jail who were wrongly convicted 20, 30 years ago because a fire that started accidentally was called an arson.
Is this wrongful conviction, has that become kind of an academic subject that is researched and by people at universities now?
Absolutely. And I think that for one reason, once you get this sort of obvious database of people who we can scientifically show with their DNA, most of those cases are rapes and murders. So we know that they would have left DNA. We know that where the DNA is left, that this person is actually innocent. Once you can prove that, it just opens up all sorts of other questions. So if these people are innocent, how'd they get convicted? Nobody thinks that this exhausts the number of people in prison who are actually innocent.
Any estimate of percentage?
Mm-hmm. So when researchers talk to people who are involved in the criminal justice system, you'll get estimates anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5%. And those numbers sound small until you go and multiply that number by the number of people who are in prison. And then you end up with this, and I don't have the math in front of me, but you end up with a significant number of people who are wrongly convicted. It takes.
Well, if you look at, I've seen the numbers around 3 million.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's
possible.
5%, that's 150,000 wrongly convicted people.
Remember that 95% of criminal cases in the United States are solved by plea bargain.
That's right. Yeah.
So whatever virtues there are to the adversarial system are not played out for 95% of those cases.
Okay, we need a wrap. Any last words?
No.
Thanks. Great show.
Not at all. Thank you.
The show has been John Noakes. He's the chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminal Justice at Arcadia University.
All right. Thanks, Rob. Are we good?